Hello, and thank you for allowing me to present the things that I have learned over the last several weeks. My name is Melissa Jolly, and I will be presenting best practices in the science classroom. Over the last several weeks, Tara Harrell and myself have been doing research in the area of science and best practices concerning the upcoming changes to the Tennessee Science Standards. We were both heavily involved in the transitions in mathematics over the last several years when those changes took place with math. We have both been put into positions where we are now taking everything that we have learned in math and applying it to the science classroom. So this presentation will give you the historical background concerning why the standards were changed, information to prepare teachers for these new standards, and we will be paying special attention to specifically the engineering practice standards, as well as how to implement best practices within the science classroom. So if we go back to 2007, after the standards at that time had been reviewed, there was a high amount of passing rates, and yet the scores on exams were very low. Tennessee received an F on their standards because of this discrepancy. So it was then that Tennessee started kind of shifting gears and reevaluating their academic standards to make them more rigorous, to be much more in line with the national standards. So this is sort of where we are now in Tennessee. So this is kind of where we are currently living as far as the Tennessee Science Standards today. So after receiving an F for the previous standards, Tennessee adopted new standards that were meant to be more rigorous. And along with those came our Tennessee State Performance Indicators, or SPIs. This is what science teachers have been following over the past several years. It was through this that the TCAP, or Tennessee Comprehensive Assessment Program, was supposed to be more in line with these new science standards. All students in grades 3 through 8 are tested on TCAP for science. End of course exams are given for high school students in biology and chemistry. So with these new, more rigorous standards, Tennessee did see some gains in science scores on these TCAP and end of course exams. However, after again another review of these standards, these standards received an overall rating of a D. They were clearly written but highly disorganized, and they were missing some very critical content in almost every single science discipline. So it is from here that Tennessee really started to take a different direction. With yet another poor rating of the standards, Tennessee began to look nationally for direction on how to once again revamp the standards. The next generation science standards in the K-12 framework have become sort of the backbone for developing these new standards. As Tennessee, though, moved away from PARCC, they decided to pull together the best of both worlds. Tennessee, along with 26 other states, had been involved in developing the K-12 framework for science education, as well as involved in the next generation science standards. However, Since breaking away from Park, Tennessee decided to structure it to fit the needs of Tennessee students, and thus our new set of standards will be called the Tennessee Academic Standards for Science. It's important to note that Tennessee teachers were heavily involved in all aspects of developing these new Tennessee Academic Standards for Science. Although the framework is there and the participation with the Next Generation Science Standards were there, Tennessee teachers were heavily involved in creating these science standards that have become very specific for Tennessee. The Next Generation Science Standards were developed by many different experts from all over, from educators to scientists, and it involved multi-states, including Tennessee. So these teams came together to develop the framework, which was later to be called the Framework for K-12 Science Education. And again, this was to become the backbone of the standards. In addition to creating the Next Generation Science Standards, Tennessee identified the science and engineering practices that will become embedded throughout science practice. So in 2011, the Next Generation Science Standards were approved. And again, this served as a guide for the Tennessee Science Standards revision process. So the vision for the new science standards for Tennessee was to improve the coherence of content from grade level to grade level so that there is a clear path of progression of learning. It was to integrate disciplinary core ideas with science as well as engineering practice, and it was to promote equity and diversity of science and engineering education for all learners. So the research came directly from the K-12 framework for science education, and it was to make sure that these new standards were developmentally appropriate and had an appropriate progression of learning. It was to integrate both science and engineering practices and embed those practices along the way throughout all the disciplines. It was also to focus on conceptual understanding and learning transfer, and to focus more on active engagement of learning. So one of the biggest shifts in these standards was to make sure that the engineering practices were more than highlighted. They were more than just a section of the learning, but that it was actually embedded throughout the learning. So in the engineering standards, there are separate standards for engineering, but that they are also embedded throughout the grade bands and throughout the other practices. So you will see these engineering standards embedded throughout the different grade bands, but that these engineering practices are also integrated throughout the new Tennessee Academic Science Standards. One of the goals is to learn science by doing that. This was sort of the idea behind the science and engineering practices being embedded throughout. The goal was to allow students to discover scientific knowledge and how engineering solutions are developed. And the K-12 science education outlines these broad set of expectations for students in science and engineering. The framework for K-12 science education is built around these three major dimensions. One that we've already talked about, which was the scientific and engineering practices and how they are embedded throughout the standards. Also, the cross-cutting concepts in these standards and a disciplinary core idea of these standards. As math educators already know, there are 8 mathematical practices sort of driving at the instructional shifts that happened with mathematics over the last several years. These science and engineering practices are not the standards themselves. They are the practices that students should be engaged in for higher learning. As many of these practices that can be engaging students during science investigations or science instruction will help create the rigor that the new standards are driving at. It will create a higher and deeper level of learning. Just as with the mathematical practices, the 8 mathematical practices, these are meant as more of behaviors that should be engaging students. Another dimension to the K-12 framework was the concept of cross-cutting core disciplinary areas of science. So within these core disciplinaries, students will be looking for patterns. They will be looking for cause and effect, studying the systems and system modes, and so on and so forth within each of these core disciplinary ideas. Tennessee has since adopted these new science standards in October of 2016. So what Tennessee must do from this point on is to begin to prepare for this change. And teachers and school leaders can prepare for this change by first becoming familiar with the framework. They need to know what it is, where it can be found, and why it is important. So how do we help Tennessee accomplish this change? This change will come from teachers and educators of science, and it is important to expose science teachers to the practices through scaffolding professional development. Tennessee had done a great job doing this with our mathematics transition, and it is important to allow science teachers the time needed for this transition. So professional development should allow teachers to deepen their understanding of these practices, to understand the disciplinary core ideas and the cross-cutting concepts. Professional development should also lead science teachers through deconstructing the new standards and focusing on the planning instruction needed for these new standards. Teachers should strive for full implementation for these new standards for the 2018-2019 school year. So there are phases to this transition. The new Tennessee standards were adopted in April of this year. So initial exposure to the framework for the new standards is the first step. So we are just now in the awareness stage. Stage 2 will be those professional developments where teachers are allowed to understand the new engineering practices, the disciplinary core ideas, and understanding what exactly cross-cutting concepts looks like. The next phase would be to deconstruct the new standards. This will allow teachers in multi-grade levels to understand where they're at, where their students are going, and where they're coming from, as well as understanding the new rigorous set of expectations. The fourth stage will be planning then around these new standards. So once teachers really and fully can grasp the expectations that are outlined with the new standards, then they can focus on what planning looks like. What does this new level of rigor look like? And then the final stage would be to fully implement these ideas in the classroom.